always surprised what I end up giving my audience, let's put it that way. I have given readings of my work, of my poetry, at different places, and I'm always surprised at how people react, especially people that grew up in western Nebraska, because nobody has ever written about this experience, about being raised in Nebraska. Everybody thinks that the Latinos, the Chicanos, they all come from Texas and you know, all along the border countries, and they forget that there's people like us in Nebraska. So no one has ever written about us and about our experience. And I want them to know by my writing that yes, we do exist, and that if someone in Texas reads it, they go, yes, there is at least one writer that is Latina in Nebraska, and I want them to know that. And I want the people to know that yes, our experience, it was important, and no, it will not be lost if I keep writing. One of the poems that I'm going to be reading is called History, and that was written because I felt like I was spending too much time when I was presenting my work explaining to people who I was and where I came from and where my family came from. So I thought a good jump-off point when I would read to people would be to tell them my history through poetry. And that's what the first poem will be. History. The promise of work brought my family north, crossing the never-ending Texas plain in a tarp-covered truck. Torn from a long tradition of family gatherings, bodas, quinceañeras, and christenings, we watched in silence as the undulating heat made the miles of highway disappear. My mother, feet swollen and pregnant, stood beside my father, 4 children pressed around her. Other families exchanged words of encouragement and made promises to the saints for a safe, fast trip. But there was always another town, a few more miles. In Colorado, long rows of barracks-like buildings welcomed us as we stepped off the truck. Questions of who can work quickly reduced our family to tally marks on a clipboard. 4 workers, 2 babies. Sleep eventually caught up with us as we inched our way through food lines, blanket lines. The first truck bound for Montana came and went, its quota filled, leaving behind disappointed faces and talk of the next one will be for us. Children laughed and played, making friendships that could last days if they were lucky, hours if they weren't. 2 weeks went by, another truck arrived, single men, couples, and families, my family, boarded, filling a wish list from farmers in a state called Nebraska. Nebraska, people whispered, a place where snowdrifts can get higher than a person's head, and sometimes over the roofs of the field laborers' houses. Summer so hot that paint on cars fades, but that promise of work urged us north. Easter, 1950, we arrived on a small farm in the middle of nowhere. Here the air was clear and fresh like the ice-cold well water that quenched our thirst. Scottsbluff Monument, a dark apparition rising from the flat prairie, silently watched us through the cracks of our walls. Nebraska, a good place to work and raise children, my parents decide, but the others packed their belongings, afraid of the snow and ice of winter, and tornadoes that fall out of the sky like thin black snakes from a torn gunny sack. We promised to carry on the traditions, family gatherings, bodas, quinceañeras, and christenings. No, they said. There are no barrios here, no corner drugstores, no hay gente. There is nothing but the wind that moans like the Llorona looking for her children. We watched in silence as they disappeared in the undulating heat. There is a progression to these poems that I'm reading right now. It's a progression of time and a progression of seasons. With the end of the season towards late spring, we would start saying goodbye to the people that had come to Nebraska to work. Some of them were cousins, some of them were just friends, some of them we saw once, some of them we never saw them again. So I wanted to write this poem. It's called The Summer of Goodbyes for them. That summer you told me stories of Texas, boys, and donkey school. I told you about Nebraska winters and showed you the arrowheads we'd found in the fields. Under the shade of cottonwoods, we made footprints in gray dirt and exchanged secrets as we watched our brothers play hide and seek in the tall green corn. You laughed when you saw how I dressed for onion harvest, like a belly dancer with burlap bag veils waving provocatively in eye-stinging breeze. Home, you said, but I'll return, and waved goodbye from the cab of your dad's old pickup. I waited, but you never returned. Pregnant, they said, and I, who had never been kissed or held a young man's hand, scattered the arrowheads in the fields. I need to explain one thing here. Donkey school. The word donkey school came from the children themselves. They would leave Texas before the end of the school season was over with, and by the time they got back, school had already started. So what the states would do, they would put them in special schools, and the kids called them donkey schools because some didn't teach them, didn't try to catch them up on the work, so they just sort of were there, and they never did catch up, so they called them donkey schools. And in fact, from what I understand, someone told me this summer that there were 3 or 4 donkey schools here in Lincoln during that time. The Summer of Goodbyes. The Summer of Goodbyes came from some of the young people that we met during the summer, the migrant workers. Some of them were family members, they were cousins, and some of them were just young people we'd meet. And young women especially, we'd see them one summer, and then maybe the next summer we wouldn't see them, and then it was either sporadic or we never saw them again. So I had to write something to remember them by, so that you know, whenever I read this, I could remember all those young women that disappeared from my life. Actually, I didn't start writing right away. When I started at the university, I was secretary full-time, and I started painting. I wanted to be an artist, thinking I had all these pictures in my head that I wanted to paint. And I kept saying, you know, there's so much there. Someone needs to put it down on paper, because we hadn't taken any pictures. And I think that's what started me thinking. I called around to the family and kept asking, you know, do you have any pictures of that time? And nobody had any pictures. During the time when we were growing up in western Nebraska, we were field laborers. And that worried me a lot. That's part of Nebraska history, and I kept worrying that was going to be gone, that once we died, that our children wouldn't have that knowledge, and they would never know where they came from, because everybody needs to know, you know, where they came from. Well, painting pictures with words, that started when I wanted to be an artist, and I wasn't able to do what I wanted to do. Someone told me, you know, you realize what you are doing is you're painting pictures with words. And I'm sitting there going, and I go, yes, I guess I am. I guess that's what I am doing. And so I try very hard to do that. I try to involve people in my writing, to where if they close their eyes, they can see the action going on. They can see a flash of color. They can see the movement. They can see the picture that I tried so hard to do with a paintbrush or with a pencil, but actually doing it in words. Some of the other ones are field poems, what I call field poems, because they haven't been named. They're just field poem 1, field poem 2, field poem 3, and they're about the experiences of working out in the fields and what it feels like to be in 100-degree weather, 103-degree weather, and working because you have to and because the family has to survive, you know, that one more summer. With fall came other work besides, by that time, the beet field work had been done. We'd cleaned the fields 2 or 3 times. The bean field work was finished. We would start doing the onion harvest, which was done on your knees. What you would do is the equipment would go through and take the onions and pile them on top of the ground, and by then the ground was very hard. And the thistles were very dry, so you ended up with all that in your knees. And what you had to do was wear a large 4-inch belt made of leather around your hips, and we were about 12 or 13, so we didn't have much hips then. And they had large hooks, about 8, 12-inch hooks. about 6 of them around the waist, around this belt. And on this belt we would hook burlap bags, 3, 4 on each one. So by the time you were walking, you were dragging these big burlap bags in the fields. And what you were to do was to kneel in the ground and to pick up these onions and put them in the bags as you moved along. And you could only fill them about halfway because we were so young we couldn't carry anything heavier. Then you take these off of these belts and then drag them to where the trucks were, and then the trucks would come by and pick them up. And that's where the eye-stinging breeze comes from. If you can imagine cutting onions for one meal and then multiplying that by a field full of onions being cut in half and wind blowing. After onion harvest, then we would have a lull. School would be starting, and even with school starting, we still had to be out in the fields. But now it was more for ourselves. The corn crop would be already done, and it would be our turn to go through and pick up what was left for our own use. So I've written Field Poem 3 about this season. Early fall. School has started, but still weekends are spent picking corn from fields the color of warm sand. Dad is waiting. The front seat of the old blue pickup covered with warm lunches, wrapped in flour sack towels, and hand-embroidered in sunflower yellow and wild violet. The giant machines of harvest sit idle next to a barn that hasn't been painted in years. Dry ears of corn, left scattered beneath layers of corn husks, dry weeds and thistles, now winter feed for chickens and large white geese that run on tiptoes, their wings spread in imaginary flight. Late December, corn will be soaked in lye, washed and ground for Christmas tamales. As we walk slowly behind the truck, we can almost smell them, hot, juicy, and spiced red with chili. The cool air echoes with our laughter and the loud crackling sound of corn stalks that lay stiff and dry beneath our feet. The family cat, a large Siamese male, has followed our voices. At day's end, we'll take turns carrying him home, tired and heavy with field mice. My son, my sisters, and my brothers, and my parents who have passed away now. Personally, some of my professors at UNL have certainly helped. Ted Kuzer, he's been my poetry teacher there, and I've had Ralph Grajeda, he's my advisor, and he is taught Chicano Lit at UNL, and he helps me a lot. Other poets, a lot of ethnic poets, Sandra Cisneros, Pat Mora. Well, Sandra Cisneros, I think her poetry is very lively and very free. I think that's what I'm striving for in my poetry, is to be able to write and not have any restrictions on my poetry. She writes about falling in love or being in love, and she's able to articulate this in poetry and not feel self-conscious about it. And I think that's where I want to get to the point where I can write about this and not be embarrassed or whatever, comes with writing. Pat Mora, I met her, I believe, last year, and she told me a wonderful thing last year. She said, we have spent a lot of time being embarrassed by some of the things that we are, speaking Spanish, being darker colored, and it's time to get past that, not to be embarrassed anymore, and just to write what you feel and to do what you can and not be embarrassed about it. Something a young man said one year when I was in class, he was talking about Maya Angelou, and he goes, Maya Angelou reads her poetry. She doesn't care if you think she's sexy or not. She just writes her poetry and it's out there. And I thought, yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to do poetry that's just out there. During the time when we were growing up, Vietnam was raging. And I found myself mesmerized by the news of young men dying, body counts. I found myself staring at the TV at all the faces, not at the newscasters, not at the entertainments, not the Jane Fondas that were there because she had money, but at the young faces around these people. At first, I must admit I looked for brown faces because I kept thinking, I'll bet one of those is a cousin or somebody's related. And then really shortly after I started doing that, I realized that all the faces were alike. They were all carried that same frightened look, that same, they could be neighbors, they could have been young men from our school. So I looked at all of them. I became afraid that if I did not watch them for one night, did not commit their faces to memory just one night, that they would die and no one would know that they had been there. So these were the faces that when I went to bed I prayed for, that they would live and come home. And I wanted to write this poem. It's called Milagros, for those young men that died, and in that war and in the other wars. Milagros, tiny silver shapes of arms and legs of human parts that can't escape the pain. Milagros enclosed behind the glass of a painting centuries old of the Virgen de San Juan. Milagros that bear witness to long-forgotten woes, an hour spent in fervent prayer for family no longer there. An altar lovingly prepared with garden flowers and many candles of varying height that stood the vigil of long nights. Tattered letters from soldier sons who went away to World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and Desert Storm. Prayers that there would be no more. The painting is all that remains, and silver milagros of pain. Nebraska influences everything I do. I write about the prairie, because we lived out in the country in the middle of nowhere. We attended a small country school. We had to cross a little itty bitty creek to get there, and the weather was always there, and the weather always changes. So nature plays a big part of all of my writing, and a lot of the people that I met growing up and as later on as an adult, they influenced my writing also. But mostly Nebraska, mostly the land. I'm very proud to have been born in western Nebraska, and I would not be the person I am now if I hadn't have gone through those experiences. I wished I had the language that I lost growing up, the Spanish language, although I had to relearn it again at the university, and by the way, pay for it. I think that's my only regret, is that I don't have the language and I don't feel comfortable enough to speak it, and I wished I could write it, because I think poetry, if I could write a poem in Spanish, that would be my ultimate goal. I like to write from my experiences. I do have poems of love, but love of family, not love of a man per se. I hope there are no poems of hate in there. I try very hard not to do that, because I don't think you accomplish a thing by screaming and yelling about something that happened 40 years ago. Who do you blame? You can't pick one person and say, you're the one that did this to me, and that's why I feel this way now. You can't say that. You can't pick one person, and it's best just to forget it. It was just an experience, something that happened in the 50s and the 60s, and it's done. Most people probably don't even know who I am, so it doesn't matter. It's what I've brought out of it. That's what's important. Life experience, yes, that's what's important, yeah. Decided to bring some poems that I hadn't read anyplace. And these are poems of now that I've grown up and my experiences of being grown up. I wanted to write a love poem. I hate love poems. And I started thinking, now, who in my life do I want to immortalize? Because that's what you do when you put their names in poetry. And I couldn't think of one. I could not think of one man that I wanted to immortalize. So I thought, okay, I'll pick a stranger. And the only stranger I could think of was a man that I danced with one night, and in a bar, no less, and it was an ugly little bar with lots of smoke. It wasn't even romantic, but I romanticized it. It's called Bailando con un Desconocido, Dancing with a Stranger. Gliding, turning, swaying like blades of tall blue grass, we danced beneath the sapphire skies. La canción de amor that you whispered, as spellbinding as your cologne, brushed against my temples, caressed my face, and settled like dusky satin against the hollow of my throat. Your words, cool and smooth as jade, wove their way through my hair and entangled themselves in my dark braid as your fingers fluttered like 1,000 Sonoran blue butterflies against my spine. Along with growing up, you find yourself meeting people and saying goodbye to them as you move from place to place, as you move from job to job. So I wrote this poem as I left a job this year and a half ago, 2 years, when I started at the university full-time. It's called Tequila Toasts. We raised our shot glasses to the moon and made a toast to breezes perfumed by wildflowers, to the lemon-colored feathers of a meadowlark, to the shimmering sound of cottonwood trees. We made a toast to each other, to our friendship, to cool nights and long-legged men. We even made a toast to the sun, rising bleary-eyed from the east. Fists dusted with salt and the taste of lime on our lips, we gathered like widows around the empty bottles of tequila. Along with growing up comes marriage, and some marriages are not very successful. I wanted to write a marriage poem because it was part of who I am. So this is an experimental piece. It's probably going to change, but for the moment, this is what it is. And it's called Marriage, Dancing on the Edge of a Precipice. First, I've got to tell you about this person. There's a Taveo. He's in Mexican mythology. He is a sorcerer that gathered a large number of people near the edge of a precipice. Beating on his magic drum, he forced them to dance deep into the night until they fell exhausted into a ravine, and there they turned to stone. After reading that, I thought, gee, that sounds an awful lot like marriage. So I decided to write this poem, Dancing on the Edge of a Precipice. The pulsating sound of Taveo's drum calls to me, seduces me into dancing. Mindless and unafraid, I dance and turn. My skirt gathers like Caspian blue whirlpools against dark thighs. My feet, a blur of motion on cold stone. I dance and turn till clouds of gray dust eclipse the sun. I dance till the light turns sapphire. I dance till the moon turns her face away. Round and round I turn, toes brushing darkness, arms slicing thick air. I dance till I'm blind, dance till all I can feel is the rush of cold air as I fall. With open arms I fall, with eyes open wide I fall into darkness, fall through rose-scented air, fall till my fevered skin begins to cool. Already I am turning to stone. Don't let age stop you. I started writing when I first took that first composition class, but I've met young people that have been writing since they were in grade school. And it intimidates me to think that someone can write that many words. And then here I am in my 40s and writing for the first time. So I say, don't let your age intimidate you. If it's in you, if you start writing, keep writing. And don't be afraid of criticism. Ask for good criticism. Find someone that's going to look at your work and critically tell you this is good or this is bad. A piece of work never gets good unless someone says, that tells you the truth, that tells you that, because you're never going to improve unless someone tells you that. And surround yourself with lots of writers. Surround yourself with, read as much as you can, fiction, poetry, anything, and don't look at colored, look at ethnic writers, look at European writers, look at the masters, but not only the masters, look at everybody. Pick up the books that have been sitting in the library shelf for years of people that have just done one book, because sometimes you find some real gems in there. I was the type of person that was very quiet and observed everything. I would hear conversations and I would sit quietly by and listen to conversations and listen to stories, and not only listen to the stories but watch the way that the people moved, because you can tell a lot about their comfort, as you know, how they move, how their hands move, how their bodies move, and I watched that. That if I don't write it down, it's not going to get written. If I don't write this history about my family, because that's what it is. It's my history. It's my brothers and sisters' history. It's my parents' history. It's my son's history. It will be lost, and then what will happen? It will have nothing to go back on. And I think of all those people that we saw out in the fields that worked so hard that you'd go by in cars and you'd see them still working when you were on your way home at 6 o'clock. And I feel really sad that nobody wrote about them, that nobody knows who they are, that just the memory, just that little flash of color is in your head, and nobody has written about them. I'm planning on doing a couple plays. I've started a couple plays. I want to do, I've started a couple of children's stories. I'm trying to do everything. And at my age, I got to go real fast before I forget. As an ending, and in honor of this lady that has visited us too early in the year, winter, wrote this poem last year. I wasn't going to bring it because I thought it was going to be 100 degrees, but the weather changed. So here goes my last poem. It's called Winter is No Lady. I read a poem by Pat Mora that was called The Desert is No Lady. And after I read that, I thought, you should see Nebraska winters if you want to see no ladies. So here's Winter is No Lady. She lifts her silk skirt around her bloodless thighs as she slides over the porch railing, leaving bits of her ruffled petticoats around the rusted nails. She rattles the door, then leaves her frosty handprints on the glass as she peers longingly into the empty house. She paces for hours, running her long bony fingers through the silver wind chimes and plucking the few leaves remaining on the tree. She moans, waiting for the moment when she can slip inside, gather the warmth of the room in her pale shawl, and leave behind the crisp scent of her perfume.